Welcome, everyone. Bienvenidas a todas. We're still letting people in through the waiting room, but it is 1 o'clock on the East Coast, 11 o'clock here where I am in Denver, so we're going to go ahead and get started. For the academics in the audience, we know this is an especially busy time for you with the start of what is no doubt the most complicated of semesters, so we're especially grateful that you can be here with us today. I am Catherine Tracy Good, Tracy to my friends and colleagues, the director of the Tools for Researchers program at the Americas Research Network, or ARENET, and I'm so happy that you've been able to join us for this presentation today. We are thrilled to have Ageeth Sluis as the first in our new series of Zoom talks called Researching the Americas, and she's here to talk about her project Warrior Power, Dreaming, Drugs, Death, and the Search for Alternate Spirituality in Mexico in the 60s and 70s. And she's also going to be talking about her time as a National Endowment of the Humanities and Council of the Overseas Research Centers, that's NEH and CAORC respectively, Senior Research Fellow with ARENET in the spring of 2020. Please note that the NEH-CAORC Senior Research Fellowship is administered by CAORC and funded by the NEH under the fellowship programs at independent research institutions. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this event do not necessarily represent those of the NEH. Now, before I introduce Ageeth, just a few words on logistics. So after the interview, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. To participate in the Q&A, please send a message via the chat function at the bottom of the screen with your question. We will put you in the virtual queue, and when it is your turn, we will unmute you individually so you can ask your question directly. Also, please be advised that this presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to ARENET's various platforms. We will contact you via the email address that you registered with to sign a release form if you participate in the Q&A after the presentation. Now, let me introduce you to my friend and colleague, Ageeth Sluis. She earned her Ph.D. at the University of Arizona. Full disclosure, we were in the same cohort, and is a professor of Latin American history in the Department of History and Anthropology at Butler University in Indianapolis, Indiana. She is also affiliate faculty in gender, women, and sexuality studies and international studies. Additionally, she has directed immersive study abroad courses and faculty development trips in the Caribbean, Mexico, and South America. Her scholarship focuses on the intersections of gender and space, as well as alternative spiritualities and the history of anthropology in Latin America. Her published articles can be found in the Americas, the Journal of Urban History, and the Journal of Transnational American Studies, among others. And her book, Deco Body, Deco City, Spectacle and Modernity in Mexico City, published with the University of Nebraska Press in 2016, looks at how new ideas about femininity and female bodies influenced urban reform in Mexico's capital city in the 1920s and 30s. In January of this year, Ageeth arrived in Mexico as an NEH-CAORC Senior Research Fellow with ARENET to conduct archival research and oral interviews as a part of her current research project, Warrior Power. And we are excited to learn more about her time in Mexico, what she found in the archives, and the impact of the pandemic on her research. And on that note, let's get on with the interview. Welcome, Ageeth.
Hi.
Okay, your first question. Your first book, Deco Body, Deco City, focused on revolutionary Mexico. What drew you from that period to the 1960s and 70s for your second project?
Hi, everybody. Also, I want to echo Tracy by thanking all of you for tuning in, because I know what an insane time this is for all of you. So thank you for being here. Yeah, it is strange how our research topics come to us, right? I think sometimes they choose us rather than the other way around. And for me, working on Castaneda, or thinking of him even as being a viable subject for a project, came early on. I was still a graduate student. I was working on my dissertation that became eventually Deco Body, and working on the 20s and 30s. And what happened was that I found myself in the kitchen one night, and my then partner was reading an article from The Nation, and it had an article by Ilan Stavans that said something about rescuing Carlos Castaneda from New Age hands, something like that. And Castaneda had been pretty influential in my life. I had read him when I was a teenager. I read him in my 20s, and in part, his work was instrumental in bringing me to the US Southwest and on to Mexico from the Netherlands. So I pondered this idea. And then when I was in Mexico the next summer doing the dissertation research, I was also part of the Oaxaca Summer seminar that Bill Beasley and Bill French used to put on. I'm not sure if it's still going. And what was really instrumental is that I met people there subsequent years as well that were working on the 60s and 70s. And one of the summers, Claudio Lomnitz was there. He had just finished Deep Mexico, Silent Mexico, which is a history of anthropology in part. And, but there were also young graduate students, Maria Munoz, who was working on indigenous movements in the 60s and 70s. Later, there was Nidia Martinez, who was working on the connections between the Mexican left and the Chicano movement during this time. So there was a lot going on. I'd always loved the 60s, of course, as a time period. And so I thought about this over the years, and the project sort of grew up in some ways separate, but alongside my other projects.
That's so interesting. I love the fact that it was a kitchen table conversation. So bringing this to Castaneda then, that he's really kind of an oddball, and he's often dismissed by serious scholars as a topic of study, especially because his anthropological work has been discounted as anthropology. Why make him the center of your research then? And what have been some of the logistical and methodological challenges of following the global phenomenon of Carlos Castaneda and his writings and ideas?
He is an oddball. He was, and highly controversial in and outside of the academy, problematic on many different levels, beyond the issue of the veracity of the work. I would say there's issues of cultural appropriation. As you mentioned, the fact that anthropologists on both sides of the borders have problems with him or just completely ignore him because feel that this is not serious work. The fact that there was by the 90s cult following of him, and even his many books, which you can see on the slides, that as the story progresses, gets ever more sensational and otherworldly and kind of bizarre, frankly. So there are a lot of issues with Carlos Castaneda. And but I think despite these issues, or maybe because of these issues, I think he is of interest to us because he was, I think, especially when it comes to anthropology and US anthropologists studying indigenous peoples in Mexico, he was very influential because he was a major crossover success between the academy and popular culture. The first book that came out in '68, The Lessons of Don Juan. Maybe you can cue to the next slide. You can see oh, I'm sorry. Never mind. It's the next slide actually, but we can stay here. Sorry. So his book that came out in '68, first it was published by the UC of California, UC Press. And it first reached an academic audience, and then very quickly after that, it became popular with artists, with filmmakers. And after that, it started sort of radiating out to a really large audience. And so his book was read by millions, and subsequent books were read by millions. I mean, none of the books that he's published, which are 12 in all, I believe, have never gone out of print. And he presented Mexico in a particular kind of way. When I was thinking about representations of Mexico as a cultural historian, my research question was, how have anthropologists and anthropological studies contributed to a particular representation of indigenous peoples in Mexico, especially during this time? And how has that influenced not only people on the US side of the border or even in Europe, but maybe even in Mexico itself, and maybe self-presentations of indigenous people themselves? And so if we think of anthropology, sure, Castaneda became outcast in many anthropological circles because the books were deemed to be, not true, or Don Juan didn't really exist. But he was able to reach such a large audience, and he continues to reach a very large audience today. And so I think that in that sense, I feel that he is a lens, a reflection of his time and place, but also in informing some of these things that were going on. And he had the moment that he burst upon the scene, so to speak, as many of us know, because we lived through it. Not me, I lived through it, but I was very, very young. But we have studied is that this is the time, of course, in the 60s of numerous movements, of enormous social political upheaval and cultural change. There's the student movement for sure, but there's also a lot of young people looking for more authentic and authentic and different kinds of lifestyles. The counterculture movement. We have the birth of second wave feminism. Needless to say, we're living in the moment that's in the wake of the civil rights movement and leaders such as Cesar Chavez. And so the visibility of Native peoples as well through later than the American Indian movement, but also indigenous rights movement in Mexico themselves, is picking up steam. And so he sort of lands at this moment, and he is able to popularize a particular Mexico. And so that was what really drew me. Now, studying him, I understood that it was not going to be just about Mexico, that this was going to be a transnational project, that I would have to look at a number of different countries, but primarily the US and Mexico, but even look further afield. And so a lot of the research did take place in the United States before I even came to Mexico.
So on that note, I thought we would we could shift gears just a little bit so that you could talk to us about the research that you conducted as part of this project in Mexico earlier this year as the NEH-CAORC Fellow with ARENET. Why in particular, because you've just mentioned that the start of the research for this project in the preceding years happened in the United States. Why was it important to conduct research in Mexico? And how did being in Mexico, being in country, make a difference to your research?
Okay. Could you go back to the previous slide? I just skipped over, and I'm sorry I did that to you. So thinking about representations, I usually when and I will get to your question, but usually when I first get to Mexico for research, and I'm in Mexico City, I go to the National Museum of Anthropology. And as most of us know, the museum is a magical place in and of itself. Certainly, I think also markets itself as such, I would say, internationally and nationally. It is the flagship of all museums in Mexico. It's houses the most important, I would say, archaeological objects that were not staying in these places that you see on the map anymore. But it has representations of all of Mexico, and the halls are organized as such. And so one of the reasons that I go there, I think, because what it shares with Castaneda is imagining this space here, Mesoamerica, there is more to the map, to the painting that is in the museum when you first enter one of the first halls. But the north is very sparsely populated in this imagination of indigenous Mexico as well, which we hopefully can return to. But as you will see, I mean, so Mexico is depicted as a place, a nature, a topography of indigenous identities that are manifested through material culture. And I find that interesting because while Castaneda doesn't really talk very much about archaeological sites, he does talk about sort of this true Mexican identity, indigenous identity, as being extremely old, as dating from before the conquest. The knowledge certainly that Don Juan the shaman that he studies has is from before the conquest. And so this kind of imagination of this land where I elsewhere in Deco body have called Camposcape, of rural Mexico, of Mexico that is not in the cities, is this kind of deep Mexico, and this kind of true identity that Carlos Castaneda plays with as well. And so this representation of Mexico, I felt, even though for some people have said Carlos Castaneda's story is a US story. You know, he wasn't Mexican, he was Peruvian. He came to the United States in the 50s, was an immigrant, and then lived the rest of his life there, supposedly, you know, going to Mexico to study shamanism. I think that this representation, sure, was made perhaps for US audiences, but yet this is important to understand how this played out in Mexico as well. And I felt that that was something that not only I needed to investigate, but I really wanted to, because the complete story was a transnational story, is a transnational story. Like I said before, I wanted to see who in Mexico had read Castaneda. He was translated. The first book came out a few years later in translation, but all of his books were translated, and he was very, very popular and continues in some circles to be popular. So I wanted to see what Mexican people of different backgrounds and ages and ideas did with him and saw him, and how that reflected on their own identity as being Mexican or even as being indigenous. So if you want to go to the next slide, because that's what, or the, excuse me, the one after that. Sorry, this is also in the museum. So shamanism in the museum, by the way, comes up a number of different times. In the first hall in the museum, you are introduced, to the painted cave, which is recreated for you in the museum, but is originally in Baja California. And so the shaman in these rock paintings that you saw before have a major have a major importance. And then the last hall, which is called the Cultures of the North, these kinds of representations come back. And again, we see these kinds of, you know, shamanic representations. So as some of you know, in the museum know, there's like 2 levels to the museum. The first level, the ground level, is archaeology, and the second level is ethnographic displays of indigenous cultures, and these halls map onto each other, but not many people make it up to the second floor. There are some representations of shamans on the second floor, as well as how shamans are in indigenous communities today, but not many people end up on the ethnographic floor, either because they want to concentrate on the archaeological riches, right? And those are foregrounded. Let's see, in terms of being in country, then I wanted to start with the museum because being in country is invaluable. We all know that. Sure, a lot of information is digitized. A lot of our documents are increasingly digitized, but we know as researchers that not only of Mexico, but I think elsewhere as well, that there's so many documents that have not been digitized. And I think what you also miss out on, even in the archival research, that you get to browse, you get to see the box that it comes in, you get to see the folder that the information is in, you get to find different things in these places that otherwise you would not find. So even the archival research is not the same. Would you be able to do it online than if you are in country? Apart from that, there are so many advantages of being in country. I got to be part of ARENET, which was incredible, meaning Greta de Leon, meaning you, but also being introduced to a group of fellow researchers and colleagues in country that I think even perhaps now with Zoom it's different, but even email exchanges, excuse me, can't replicate. They can't replicate those kinds of contacts. And then you can also just be out on the street and find things. So you find maybe an issue of a magazine or an issue of a journal that you hadn't seen before. You come upon an event that makes you think differently about your project. You just come upon protests, and so or other kinds of groups of people, and so just living daily in the culture, I think is invaluable. And I really want to thank ARENET and CAORC and the NEH for allowing me that opportunity and that time in country.
Excellent. I've skipped ahead here a little bit, but I thought now maybe we could talk about some of the archives that you worked in while you were in Mexico and some of the things that you found while you were there.
Yes, absolutely. So when I was, my plan for Mexico was coming to Mexico City first. That's the archival landscape I'm most familiar with. Then again, as a historian, I was working in a different country as a time period is concerned, and I can definitely understand why some scholars stick closely to their time period, because it does make for a different archival experience, because you will go to different archives, for instance. So I first came to Mexico City to connect with ARENET, to set up a plan, to set up meetings with colleagues there, and to basically do a reconnaissance missions of the primary archives, the largest archives that I thought I was going to work in, and to see what was there, and then to sort of map things out. So I would come back to those archives towards the end of my trip, or the last couple of months of my time there. Then I went on to Oaxaca, where I had been before and had studied before, but hadn't done very much archival work at all. And so that was a new experience. That photo was taken there. That was actually in the, let's see, the Fundación Bustamante Vasconcelos. As you can tell, an older colonial building. I looked at newspapers. I looked at magazines, government report, photograph collections. What I was interested in was basically anything that had to do, and the intersections of indigenous people, information, just generally, anthropological studies that maybe found their way into more popular press. I was interested in understanding tourism and how constructions of indigenous identity figured into tourism in Oaxaca. I wanted to see if I came across anything having to do with Maria Sabina, who was a very famous curandera that supposedly Don Juan Castaneda shamans is modeled on, and also wanted to see if I can find anything about the use of psychedelic mushrooms, magic mushrooms. I did not think that I would come across anything that had to do with Castaneda or would mention Castaneda, because I knew that by the time the 70s roll around, that he, especially in Mexico, is not somebody that people find important, or that anthropologists find important. But I was hoping that maybe I would come across something having to do with him. And so what I did find archival research, as we know, can be humbling, right? Because if you want to go to the next slide, Tracy, thank you. It takes alarmingly long time to go through just a year worth of daily newspapers. This is what I rediscovered. And I think that in terms of archival research, this is sort of what people working in more recent time periods, how their research is different from, say, Tracy's work as a colonialist. Might not be so many documents, but the documents that there are have interesting, difficulties to work with in their own right. But for us, working in these time periods, it's usually just going through enormous amounts of information and trying to find something of interest, which I did, as you can tell from so one of the newspapers that I researched was the Oaxaca Gráfico, sorry. And increasingly, I did find references to hippies. I found references to los hongos alucinantes, so the magic mushrooms. I found increasingly reports having to do with Maria Sabina. So, this was something that took time, but that did produce some results. I never found anything directly mentioning Castaneda, but I did find a lot about hippies and increasing concerns about hippies and hippies setting up communes around Oaxaca City, but also in Huautla, where this community in the mountains, Mazatec, where Maria Sabina is from. So it can also be, and maybe you can go to the next slide, Tracy, elating as when I found the entire correspondence between Gordon Wasson, who was the person, not an anthropologist himself, an amateur anthropologist who in the 50s goes to Mexico because he's interested in mushrooms, he's publishing on mushrooms, and his wife, whose drawing this is, by the way, of these particular mushrooms that they found in Huautla growing and that Maria Sabina used. He's an amateur, he's scholar, but he was very, very interested in finding this. And so his correspondence with this anthropologist who was not very well known. I think a lot of people don't know about her, Irmgard Lanar Johnson, who basically was born and grew up in Mexico, and for all practical purposes was a local, but doesn't really get credit. And she is the one who introduces him to these communities. She's the one who introduces him to these curanderos and curanderos there, and that's how he meets Maria Sabina. He is then supposedly one of the first people who, as an outsider, takes the mushrooms, is part of the ritual, and then writes about the mushrooms, publishing it in Life magazine in 57. So that was amazing. And also part of this correspondence as well was Dr. Albert Hoffman, which some of you who maybe know your LSD and Timothy Leary history, you will know that Albert Hoffman was the first one to synthesize psilocybin, the active ingredient in the mushrooms, for Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland, and which led to the manufacture of LSD, and then to doctors like Timothy Leary at Harvard using LSD for clinical studies. So coming upon those documents was amazing, and it was very unexpected.
Here's a little one.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I was also able to do, I did not make it all the way to Huautla de Jimenez. I did go to Ixtlan, which is up in the mountains, and that's the picture that you see sort of as the background to these two articles. These two articles, for those of you who don't read Spanish, it's pretty easy, right? It's like the hippies that are in Huautla that are of concern, hippies that are moving even closer to the city of Oaxaca and that are behaving badly. This idea was that Maria Sabina was written up in the press as pretty negatively, actually, as somebody who either let out secrets or, secondly, made, if not a fortune, but made money on catering to Westerners coming to learn about these things, and also was part of these communes and leading, this sort of bacchanalian rites, and which was not true, but this was how it was written up in the press. So this is very interesting how Maria Sabina was depicted in the Mexican press. This particular is also part of the Imgaard's papers. Imgaard by Lanar was married to, oh my goodness, I forget his first name, but an anthropologist, Johnson, who she met when she was going to school at Berkeley in the 40s and 50s. He died young, but he was one of the first ones to conduct these kinds of studies in Huautla and really looking at indigenous peoples, not only the way they lived, how communities were organized, but also their worldview and how these particular mushrooms were part maybe of that worldview. And so this particular image I think is interesting because it's the kind of early anthropological notes where half of it is in English, half of it is in Spanish, some of it is in Mazatec or Mixtec, or Zapotec, but very much picking out these kinds of things that a Westerner thinks as black magic, whereas I'm not sure that maybe the people there thought of it as such. So
okay. So I think this brings us to our next question. Because along with the archival research, you've also conducted interviews with people who either knew Castaneda or are familiar with the phenomenon of his books and ideas in Mexico. Could you talk about how these interviews are contributing to your project?
This was very important for me, and to be honest, a little nerve-wracking. I was completely new, still say I'm completely new to anthropological method. I was trained as a historian. I work in the archive. I generally studied people who are no longer here, who I cannot talk to unless it's a seance, I guess. But so to actually talk to people, to observe people, to be part of things, I had hoped to do that. So I had set out to interview people, as I explained, about Castaneda, about reading Castaneda, and I was able to do that both in Mexico City and also in Oaxaca. I had hoped to maybe interview curanderos and curanderas, but I wasn't sure how that was going to work out. And this is one of these other boons of being in country, because these fortuitous moments, these chance moments where you come upon something, somebody who really helps the project or gives the project a shape or a direction that you didn't even think about, happened in Oaxaca as well. I was able to interview a number of curanderas, and it was just by happen chance. It was basically people knowing people, and I was able to also see some of them work, do limpias and do other rites, other than just interviewing them, and sort of learned a lot from them in terms of the development of not only how they came to be curanderas, how they saw themselves, but also how that intersected with the growth of spiritual tourism to Oaxaca as well, and gave me pause and gave me different ideas of how we think about authenticity and tradition even, and how these things are constantly in flux. So I think that I would have liked to do more, and hopefully can do more of these kinds of interviews and go back and follow up with people, but it really enriched the project. And again, to gesture to the slide that's up, and our discussion about Maria Sabina, who was a celebrity in the 60s and the 70s for sure. This also happened because Wasson was not supposed to use her real name in his publications, but did. And so people came to sought her out to do mushrooms with her, and she increasingly tired of her foreign visitors and maybe even elite Mexican visitors who came to see her. But like I said, she was much maligned, in Butler itself, in Oaxaca, and for the reasons that I described. And so to be in Oaxaca and to come upon, this mural that you see in the center there, which, with the Zapotec Oaxaca name above it, and Oaxaca's luminaries, there you have Porfirio Diaz, and maybe you can't see him, but on the other side, of course, Benito Juarez, who's, the central figures in Mexican history, but definitely in Oaxaca history. But now Maria Sabina is in the middle. She is legitimized now, and even together with the hongos, together with the mushrooms, there she is. And you see her portraits everywhere in Oaxaca now, also in part of a tourist Oaxaca that wants to see her and is interested in her. So these kinds of things you would not know about if you weren't in country.
Absolutely, that mural is fascinating, I think. So right now, I think I hate to use the dreaded word pivot for all the academics in the audience, but the U.S. academics in the audience. But I wanted to change gears just a little bit and talk about what the pandemic has meant for your research. Your plan was to be in Mexico through the end of May, but you had to go home back to the States in mid-March. So if you could talk a little bit about what you were able to accomplish, and you've done that, but how you've had to adapt your research in the face of the pandemic, and what that means in terms of challenges, but also maybe some unexpected benefits or insights.
Okay. Well, at the risk of sounding self-absorbed, especially in the face of so many people have had and still are having to endure in the face of this pandemic, having to return after merely a month and a half was heartbreaking, to be quite honest. I felt like I'd just gotten started, and I gathered a lot of information, but I felt I was hitting my stride. After my time in Oaxaca, I was ready to return to Mexico City, armed with my findings that I had gotten in Oaxaca, and reconnecting with ARENET and with colleagues there and running things by them, obviously continuing the archival research, and to, if time permitted, to do research in Sonora, up in the north as well. And needless to say, that did not come to pass. That was not to be. I think in accomplishments, I think I've outlined, I was happy to be able to also incorporate anthropological methods into my research. I felt it sort of slowed me down. There's only so much time in a day. But it allowed me to sort of triangulate my findings in ways that I've never been able to do before. To look at the interviews and participant observation and compare and contrast them with primary sources and the secondary literature. That was extremely helpful. When I came back, obviously it had seemed like everybody and everything was online, and we know, of course, that that's not entirely true. One of the curanderas that I'll call her Gertruda, not her real name, quite old, indigenous, lower socioeconomic status, definitely not online. Some of the documents I longed for, not online. And so I had to change strategies. And so what I did was going over what I'd already found, transcribing the interviews, weaving in the notes together into a narrative about what I had observed, really going into detail, looking at all the photographs that I had taken of the archival documents, and started working from there. And I think if there is a silver lining, which, you know, I think it's dangerous to use that word because it's a pandemic after all, but one of the unexpected benefits was to have the time to reflect, because I feel, like I said before, we move through so much information, and especially when we're in country, we're trying to get as much as we can so that when we're back home, hopefully, and we have time in our summers as academics, then we write up the research or we come to terms with that. But I think for me, I really had time to reflect upon the experience and to work in the theory and the historiography and the secondary literature in a way that probably I would have not had time for before. In terms of colleagues, I found myself online in Zoom writing groups with colleagues that are far away, and I think that had it not been for the pandemic, that maybe I wouldn't have turned to Zoom so quickly to work together with other researchers and other colleagues that way. So if there is an upside, that's sort of been the upside. But having said that, I can't wait to return to Mexico to finish the research, COVID permitting.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm unmuted. I have one last question here, but I'm gonna go ahead and start the Q&A. My last question was about thinking about the relevance of our research to the current moment. But I'm gonna leave it to our audience to ask that question now. So remember, if you have a question, please ask it in the chat box, and then I will come to you individually and allow you to ask your question directly of Ageeth. And our first question comes from Cynthia Radding, the chair of the ARENET Board of Directors.
Ageeth, this is a fascinating project, and it's a wonderful opportunity to learn about it. I wanted to ask if your research design about this alternative spirituality and the alternative spirituality, if you are trying in any way to link this to the heightened political environment in Mexico during this period, through the 1960s and the 1970s, with the student movements, of course, but also with the agrarian movements that were taking place, particularly in places like Oaxaca.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thanks also for being here, and thank you for your question. Absolutely. I have to say that that's also being housebound in terms of the pandemic, where I've been looking at the secondary literature that's been so wonderfully developing when it comes to my peers who've been writing about the dirty war in Mexico and writing about guerrilla movements and agrarian movements. And in Oaxaca, but I think also very much in the north, right? And so that was going to be sort of my next step, to try and understand that. One of this is a project I feel, and I don't know if you can see the board behind me, it's sort of a vision board that I know we see on television, detective series a lot, but it really helped me to visualize and to look at the various tentacles and to look at the various things that are feeding into this. And yes, I find that the political moment in Mexico and also in the United States is really important to understand what happens with Indigenous people as they organize for their own rights. And there I have to say I am looking to my colleague Maria Munoz, who has been working on that and doing really remarkable work in terms of, there's also information, of course, in the archives, the INI archives, that I didn't get to in Mexico City as well. But I'm hoping to to go back and to really look at that information, because it's extremely important. And I also have to say, one of the things that I came to later than when I first started to envision the project is also the connections with the Chicano and Chicana movement, you know, and conceptualizations of Aslan. And so there are political dimensions to this, even though Castaneda himself was not political. The books do not have overt political messages, but what there is a validation of indigenous identity, and I think that for the time was quite revolutionary already. What for those people who do not know, what made Castaneda's work different is that Don Juan speaks for himself, and it's very obvious in the books that Don Juan has a wisdom that Carlos, as the student and the student who is at UCLA, just does not get, does not understand, does not even come close to. So all to say, there is a political part to this, and thank you for bringing that up, because that definitely needs to be developed more.
Paul Hansen.
Nice to see you, Ageeth. I mean, I've been listening to you talk about this project, at least off and on, for what, probably 6 years now, I suppose. You mentioned here today that when you got into the archives and when you got to Oaxaca, you found some things that surprised you that that you were not expecting. So my question is, do you feel right now as if this is a project kind of in flux? You've got your vision board behind you. Do you feel like you have a handle on it, or are you still trying to figure out where this is going to end up?
Well, I think it's going to be, thanks, Paul. Thanks for being here, and thanks for your question. I think it's going to be an interesting book with open-ended questions. I feel some of the things that I found in the archives, specifically Imgaard's papers, that could be an article in and of itself. I mean, it's very rich. One has to be careful sometimes that the tentacles don't go too far out, right? That you just ended up just wanting to take all information that you found and fold it into this project. I think where this project is going, and I think that's what's Tracy's, if I may segue, because I think they're related. Tracy's last question about the relevance of the project, maybe especially in this time, is that to think about how that particular political moment, as Cynthia brought up as well, of the 60s and 70s, both in Mexico but also in the United States, is, and at the risk of sounding a little teleological, but it is an unfinished project, right? It is an unfinished time. We are still living in Black Lives Matters, people of color, these protests that we're seeing, you know, the policies of this administration when it comes to immigration, and how that echoes on and throughout these countries and throughout the years, and especially the kind of horrific situations that we have at the border right now. I think for me, that is also where we can think about Castaneda as there are promises there. There are promises in this time and in this book that I think when it comes to race relations, when it comes to ethnic and racial identities, when it comes to, I mean, we haven't been able to talk about this, but issues of masculinity, that are not finished, that we are still living with today. And I think for me, when I think about the book, I think the last chapter is going to be about, yes, the cultural appropriation that feeds into the commercialization of the new age and commercialization of these particular kinds of practices, not only when it comes to tourism, but when it comes to book sales, when it comes to all kinds of new age practices today. But I also think that we have to think about maybe, unpacking what was part of this moment, the 60s, that gave way to what some historians think is the darkness of the 70s. And so I'm not sure if I'm asking your question. I think what I'm saying is that I don't completely know. But at the same time, I do think that what I want to do is give it a particular relevance. And I think that relevance is there in terms of the current moment.
Okay, our next question comes from Robin Turner. Let me unmute. There, are you there, Robin?
Yes.
Okay, the floor is yours.
So hello, Ageeth, and this has been really interesting. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about how you're sort of thinking about spiritual tourism, whether it has been connected with sort of how Castaneda was presenting people, or how more generally people that aren't indigenous may be traveling to Mexico connected to some perception of indigenous wisdom and healing. And so I know you just referenced cultural appropriation, so I don't know if that's, but if you could just say a bit more about that.
Thanks, Robin. Good to see you too. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think when we looked at this, and that's one of the things that I want to do in the book too, is this arc of sort of the birth of the new age, which Castaneda is very much part of, and then when it sort of land in our neoliberal moment today, there is a lot of appropriation. And early on, activists, Native American activists in the United States, but also some Indigena voices as well, would have called Castaneda a plastic shaman, right? I mean, these kinds of people who appropriate, white people, I should say, which Castaneda is, an interesting case here, because he is, in Latin America, he would be understood as mestizo. But he characterizes himself in his books and his few interviews that he did do as a European man, which I always find very, very interesting. But I think he means a Western person. But so, yeah, these white people who appropriate indigenous identities, and that starts happening in the wake of the Castaneda phenomena, I would say. Maybe it happens before, but not in the numbers, and not with the kind of levels of success, also financial success, as we see after Castaneda. And so what is interesting there in terms of cultural appropriation is that you also then have Mexican Americans or Latino people that also appropriate this for their own purposes as well. And so what I'm finding now is that there's actually this whole ball of wool in terms of to what extent some people have appropriated some of the ideas that show up in Castaneda and use them for themselves. You see this too in the Amazon, the ayahuasca tourism, right? Which is very much a Western-driven kind of phenomenon, but there's an ayahuasca based church in Brazil. Many people go to be healed, but I think also indigenous peoples themselves are appropriating bits and pieces or reappropriating, and championing this as their own heritage. And but they're facing the sort of capitalist machine. So in terms of the spiritual tourism, what is interesting in Mexico early on, I'm meaning in the 70s, what you get are people going to large archaeological sites as well. And so you see people, doing the clapping at the base of the pyramid, and there's like lots of people in white, and there's trips organized. And Castaneda himself, by the 90s, had founded a corporation, Clear Green Corporation. And so part of what they do was organize workshops and also organize trips to now all over the world, but in the beginning to Mexico and to these particular sites. So I'm not sure to what extent I answered your question, but I think one of the ways to look at this, and I know you've studied, you know, particular kind of tourism as well, is to see the different actors in these kinds of phenomena, and how they get to profit, how they get to shape these discourses and these businesses, right?
Excellent. Okay, we have one last question from Shole Sharoki. Are you there, Shole?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. The floor is yours.
Okay, just so you don't think I'm a snapdragon. Hi, hi, everybody. Thank you, Ageeth. That was a lovely introduction. Very quickly, my question, I know that you have extensive work and research on gendered and sexuality politics. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that in your current work. And I can already see some of that in what you introduced. For example, I can see you speaking about how, like Maria Sabina, as a woman shaman, now inhabits a space in this like collective memory in the shape of being part of that mural, which is otherwise very masculine space. Or in terms of Castaneda himself and the kind of embodiment that kind of new age return to spirituality and LSD in the US particularly. In the 80s, as an ex-hippie, I say this, in the 80s, at least in California, there was this idea of sexual appeal that embodied that aura of sexual appeal that was always embedded in the narrative of the Castaneda of stories, you know. So I'm wondering if your research is dealing with any of that.
Thanks, Shole. So good to see many of my Butler colleagues. Thank you all for tuning in. I know how busy you are. Thanks for your question too. Yes, absolutely. And I think when I first started the project and the first papers that I presented and the first article that I wrote very much looked at issues of gender, because to me it was amazing that a figure like Don Juan, the shaman in Castaneda's work, modeled, most probably, as I can think now, the research that I've done is Don Juan is an amalgam of probably a number of different people that Castaneda was in contact with or that he appropriated from other anthropologists studying other shamans, but it was also heavily modeled on Maria Sabina. And so Maria Sabina takes a back seat to Don Juan in some ways. Yes, she becomes famous, but at the moment that we're talking about in the 60s and the 70s, she is not as famous as Don Juan is, even though nobody can find Don Juan because he probably doesn't exist as a person. So that kind of, then the appropriation that we talked about earlier is also a gendered one, I would say. And there is an interesting strand that runs through this, and the appeal of the shaman, being in part a sexual one. And I haven't come across this in Mexico as much, but I do know from the secondary literature that this has really been an issue in spiritual tourism in Peru. So in the Andes and around Machu Picchu, and also in Cusco, there are many, and there have been since the 80s, many young men who, promise female tourists, particular kind of knowledge and particular kind of experiences, and so, are seen as desirable as men. Because they have this particular kind of knowledge that we Westerners do not have, and then we Western women really do not have, I guess. But so what you do see in Castaneda, and what gets really a little bit bizarre in terms of when we fast forward to the 90s, it's very interesting what you're saying about the 80s, and I did not know that, so maybe to talk a little bit more. By the 90s, there is, he's no longer just an author, and he has this corporation. There are these workshops while he is still alive. And the people that gravitate to him, I mean, sure, there are men that gravitate to him as well, but are largely women. He has an inner circle of women whom he calls the witches, and that are very close to him. And so there is that aspect. And I do think that for men early on, their Don Juan says and does things that in some ways are honing a particular kind of masculinity, and that masculinity is warrior-like, but it is not an old kind of masculinity. So this is something that new left men trying to look for new models of masculinity can find themselves in, because there is a particular understanding of tenderness, of caring for humanity, of maybe even gender equality to a certain extent, but it is then still honing, your masculinity to become a warrior and a man of knowledge. So that is very much in those kinds of discourses, and yes, I will be doing a lot with that in the book.
Excellent. Well, we're going to wrap up our talk today with Ageeth Sluis. Thank you so much, Ageeth. This was fascinating. I wish that we could continue with the conversation. It's such an interesting and important project. I'd also like to thank Greta de Leon, the executive director of ARENET, who is managing the tech behind the scenes. I'd especially like to thank CAORC and Katie Jost in particular, who has helped us to advertise this talk and is always a support for us. And we'd also like to thank all of you who've attended today. It's really so fantastic that you could come out for an hour this afternoon, or for some of us in the morning, to learn more about the research that's happening both through ARENET and also through this remarkable scholarship or fellowship program through the NEH and CAORC. Please stay tuned. Follow us on social media. We're active on Facebook and on Twitter, so that you can see what our upcoming talks will be. We have 2 series of talks right now, Researching the Americas, which was this series, and then our series on the Iberian borderlands, the Oxford Handbook of Borderlands of the Iberian World. We're doing a series of talks with the authors called Iberian Borderlands in Cyberspace. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at the next talk.